Hi, I'm John Derrick, and my wife and I are currently in the process of writing a book called Conscious Fire, Mind Over Matter, You Were Born Wealthy. And one thing we thought would be interesting to do would be to start a video blog of essentially some of the chapters that we've been writing about. And one of the chapters that we've written about deals with uncertainty, um, determinism, conscious thought, and how all these things relate to one another. And to make this shorter than the book, we're going to introduce just a few concepts that you may or may not have already heard of. One of the things we're going to start with is something called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle is basically a theory that says, that in any given atom, there is a cloud of electrons, and that you cannot know where one of these electrons is and know how fast it's going, and you cannot know how fast it's going and know where it is. There's always uncertainty involved. And in reality, that the electrons are actually in more than one place at the exact same time. So this uncertainty is what I believe kind of presents the idea of free will, of choice, of the chaotic nature of the electron in the atom, provides us what I would call free will and gets us away from determinism. One of the other things that we write about in this chapter is getting into a little bit more complex subject is the many worlds theory. The many worlds theory essentially says that for every given situation, say brushing your teeth or combing your hair, that the world has to split into two different worlds, and that you are in one of them consciously, and only one of them consciously. You exist in both, but you're only consciously aware of yourself in one of them. And I always found this really interesting. I had considered the possibility of there being many worlds in my life, but I had never really thought a lot about it. I've heard about it, some scientists talk about it, but again, hadn't really considered it myself. But the thing I don't like about the many worlds theory is that it's very deterministic. It's cause and effect, where the effect sometimes is the next cause, and I'm not a big fan of causality. I don't particularly care for cause and effect. I think it happens in the macroverse. I think it happens in the microverse, but there's one thing that sets me, you, and every other conscious being apart, and that is our consciousness. So what I came to discover next was something called the Copenhagen interpretation. And the Copenhagen interpretation kind of deals back into the uncertainty principle. And one of the things that Niels Bohr said in 1920 was that a quantum particle doesn't exist in one condition or another, but in all possible conditions at once, all those positions, all those places at once. The observation, which is critical in this theory, is what determines the condition or the position, and it forces it to choose one prospect over another. The one that's forced is what we observe, and thus our reality. This may sound strange, this may sound, or may not even make any sense at all. What he's essentially saying is, though, observation is critical. In a lot of quantum physics, the observer causes what they call the wave function collapse. And a good example of this is actually the double slit experiment, which I'm going to explain the best as I've come to understand it. And the best way to look at it is if you were to take a gun that could shoot marbles, and you had a single slit, and you had a blackboard behind the slit. If you were to fire the marble gun through or at the single slit, you'd end up with a single line on the blackboard where the marbles had gone through the slit. It makes complete sense. So if you were to take the slit and make it a two slit, what would you get on the blackboard? Well, you'd get two parallel lines where the marbles had gone through and formed the two parallel lines on the blackboard. So next they tried this with a wave, and what they did was they created a wave, and as the wave went out and hit the single slit, it formed basically a new wave on the other side of the slit that went out, hit the blackboard, with the most intensity being a single line. And again, pretty much what they expected. When they put two slits in with the wave went out, and when it hit the two slits, it formed two new waves on the other side that went out and caused what we call an interference pattern on the blackboard. Essentially, the wave had canceled itself out in certain places where it had interacted with one another, and it created this interference pattern. So we knew now what a particle looked like, or the marble looked like, and we knew what a wave looked like. A particle would cause either a straight or parallel lines, whereas a wave would cause either a single line or this pattern of interference. So they got the idea, well, let's try this with an electron. A particle. Let's see what happens. It should behave exactly like the marble. So they put in the single slit, and they fired an electron gun at the single slit. And, of course, they got the single line on the back of the blackboard. So they said, well, let's put the two slits in. So they put the two slits in, they fired the electron, and the strangest thing happened. They didn't get the two parallel lines. They got the pattern of interference. The electron was behaving like a wave. A particle was behaving like a wave. What was essentially happening was the electron was getting fired from the gun, was splitting itself in two, going through both of the slits, coming back together, interfering with itself, and forming the interference pattern. But how could a particle act like a wave? Well, scientists were very eager to figure out what was going on here. So they put something in place to observe which of the two slits the electron was going through, because nobody wanted to believe it was actually going through both of them, or none of them, simultaneously. But as soon as they put something in place to observe which of the two slits the electron was going through, the particle went back to behaving like a particle. It formed the two parallel lines on the blackboard. The wave of the interference pattern disappeared. The act of observing it changed it. It was as if the electron was aware it was being observed and thus behaved again like a particle. I've always thought this was one of the strangest experiments I'd ever heard. I've actually seen it take place, and it still kind of boggles my mind even though I'm very familiar with it. But the act of observing is really critical, and I think it proves the whole point of what we're going to get at here. Because one other thing that I found really interesting is something called quantum entanglement. And essentially what quantum entanglement is if you again were to take two electrons and you were to entangle them, they would be, they would have properties reliant on one another. They would in all essence be identical to one another. If you were then to carefully separate these two, put them over any distance, you could put one on the far side of the moon, you could put one on the far side of the earth, wouldn't matter. The distance could be across the universe. They continue to communicate over any distance, faster than the speed of light, to stay the same. So, again, scientists said, well, what happens if we observe one of them? Well, when you observe one, they both change instantaneously and simultaneously to be different. One is a positive, one forms a negative. They change faster than the speed of light. They communicate faster than the speed of light, and the act of observing them is what changes them. Again, how can this be? How can an observation cause something like this to change? So, one thing that I've gotten into recently was the idea of, we look at string theory and M theory, and basically M theory says that there are 11 dimensions in all, and that 10 spatial dimensions and 1 dimension of time, and that in these 11 dimensions there are membranes, or brains, that essentially make up everything we know. And so what we're talking about is if you look at an atom, and you see that the atom has protons and neutrons and electrons, that if you look smaller, you get quarks, and if you look smaller, you get strings. And then ultimately what you're seeing is these membranes or strings that are vibrating, at a certain frequency that form all the matter we know. So that basically we're not living in this world of empty space where we think there's just openness. I have matter, this desk has matter, this computer has matter, air has matter, and it's just one big membrane. In fact, the entire universe is one big membrane. The open and empty space in the universe they think is actually part of what they call the Higgs field, and that's why they're under the elusive search for the Higgs boson, which would be the smallest quanta of the Higgs field. But essentially what it gets at is that the entire universe is basically just one large membrane. So one thing that scientists have come up with is that in this 11-dimensional space, that if two membranes were to collide with one another, would you get a Big Bang? Would you get a universe, a new bubble, so to speak? Well, a lot of scientists think that's exactly what happens. They think that new universes are being born all the time as membranes slam into one another. So I came up with this idea of what I call a hybrid universe. Essentially what it is that if you were to have a universe that was pure consciousness, there was no physical part to it whatsoever, and you had one universe which was physical but had nothing conscious in it, nothing alive in it, and the two were to collide or become entangled with one another, what would you get? Would you get this world? Would you get you? Would you get me? Would you get everything we know of as conscious? Would we get our conscious and physical bodies? You know, in the movie The Matrix by the Wachowski brothers, they basically make the insinuation that our bodies are nothing more than the mental projection of our physical or spiritual selves. So, I don't think it's a stretch to say that if you had a world of spirituality and you had a world of physical, that the two could collide to form what we have in front of us now. Because one thing that's always eluded scientists, psychologists, and pretty much anybody else, including philosophers, is this idea of the mind-body problem. And that is, how does the supernatural mind connect to the physical body? Some people say it happens in the brain, some people say it happens at the cellular level, which is what I tend to believe. But there's never been any proof of how these two connect. There are scientists who say it's purely biological, that the mind, consciousness, is biological. I don't personally buy into this. I don't think that we can compare consciousness to a bodily function. I don't think that a bodily function or a bunch of atoms could ever arrange themselves in any manner, even at a higher level, to understand the concept of tomorrow, or calculus, or physics, or quantum mechanics. I don't think our atoms can arrange themselves to understand these kind of things. I think the mind is supernatural to the body. I honestly believe it comes from a spiritual reality, and that it has interacted with our physical reality, that the two are in essence entangled with one another. So what all this gets down to is, if we want to consider everything that we've looked at, that we know that there is uncertainty, that we know that there is this idea of free will, that we know there's this idea of choice in how we observe something, because we have the ability to say that our habits, our beliefs, our thoughts about something choose how we observe. If we take all this into account, and we take into consideration that quantum entanglement is real, and we take into account that string theory is the best known theory today to explain the theory of everything, the four fundamental forces, the Big Bang, how everything occurred, then we have to consider that our conscious thoughts can change our reality. And one of the examples in the book that we talk about is wealth. And basically what we say is, if you are in a reality where you are wealthy, and you're in a reality where you're not wealthy, and you want to get and you're consciously in this reality, but you want to get to the one where you are wealthy, that if you align your thoughts with, I am wealthy, I have good health, I have good relationships, I have all the money that I could possibly want, that the universe has absolutely no choice but to align you with this reality, that you have to consciously be in this reality. So what it comes down to is if you change your thoughts, you change your world. You change your thoughts, you change your reality. The universe has to respond in line. Some people call this the law of attraction. I call it the law of vibration. But the universe has to align itself with that of your thinking. So basically, what we're telling people is, go out, change your thoughts, change your world. And what we'll get to in future videos is essentially this idea of how the subconscious comes into play here. But for now, I'm just going to leave it what I said a moment ago. Change your thoughts, change your world. Thanks for listening. I'm John Derrick.